Do we live in a free nation? Do we have government of the people, by the people, for the people? Let's take a look at it today. What do you think?
Those who forsake the law praise the wicked. Those who uphold the law resist them. Welcome to the Voice of Resistance. Here's your host, Randall Terry.
So what do you think? Do we live in a free republic? Do we have representative government? Do we have the rule of law? Another question to ask. I am going to probably settle on the negative, or as the English used to say, the answer is in the negative. But before I do, I want to tell you what I'm after here. I'm after your safety. I'm after your safety and the safety of your family on two levels. One is spiritual, regarding the divine, perhaps divine judgment. And the second is in the natural. And both require a proper formation of our mind, of our thinking, and the ability to see things as they are, not as they were, and not as we wish they would be, but as they are. Patrick Henry made history with his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, but he was going against the tide and against some very well-respected men in St. John's Church there in Richmond when he made that speech. But he had the courage to speak with clarity and to assess what was going on around him accurately. And there are historians who say if it had not been for that one speech, it is possible that America would have been defeated, because the one speech is what caused Virginia to declare war, the Rump Parliament of Virginia. So seeing, feeling, assessing what is going on accurately is critical in the natural, but also in the spiritual. There are many of us who are familiar with passages in the Bible that speak of the joy of the Lord and God's desire for us to have joy and for Him wanting us to have peace. And those passages are all true. But part of our duty, both in the natural and the spiritual, is to rightly divide the word of truth. Did you know that there was a group of people in the Bible who were spared the judgment of God specifically because they sighed, they grieved, they mourned? If you're not familiar with the passage, it's Ezekiel chapter 9. Let's take a quick look at it together. Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, "Draw near, you executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand." And lo, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, every man with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen, with a writing case at his side. And they went in and stood before the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherubim on which it had rested to the threshold of the house. So God's glory is leaving, okay? And he called to the men clothed in linen. This is a vision Ezekiel's having, and there's angels here. He called to the men clothed in linen who had the writing case who at his side, and the Lord said to him, "Go through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it." The NIV translates it, "Put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it." Do you grieve? Do you groan? Do you lament? Do you sigh and cry, one translation puts it? Do you shed tears over the detestable abominations that are done in America? If so, it may end up saving you. I mean, that is, if this passage in any manner, shape, or form replicates or duplicates itself in American history. Because look at what it says. "And to the others he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him and smite. Your eye shall not spare, you shall show no pity. Slay," that means kill, "old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but do not touch one upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the house. And goes on to show that these angels in his vision went, starting with the elders in the house of God. That's why Peter said judgment will begin in the house of God. He was referring back to Ezekiel 9. He said that God sent these destroyers to kill everyone who did not grieve and mourn and wail and sigh. So if you are grieved for the state of America, God bless you. And if you're talking to your fellow Christians and they're like, it's no big deal, we'll just pray, we'll just trust the Lord, it's a sign that the Lord is coming back. Hey, you want to go to a barbecue? If there's nothing in them that resonates, and they look at you like you're messed up because you're grieving the state of our nation, trust me, they are the ones that are in peril, not you. They're the ones that are completely out of step with the Lord our God, because if they saw things as they are, okay, and if they could feel the grief of heaven, they too would grieve. In James chapter 4, in fact, I'll give you this verse, and then we'll come back from a break. He said, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you men of double mind. Be wretched. Another version says, be afflicted, mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to dejection. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. A lot of us want to be exalted by the Lord. We want to have this great victory in America. We want to restore the republic, but we don't want to pay the price of admission. We don't want to go on the path that Almighty God has designated, okay? It's a path of conflict. It's a path of rejection. It's a path of us picking up our cross, dying to ourselves and following Christ. It's a path of us grieving and mourning and weeping and begging God for mercy in the midst of his judgment. If you want to be a part of the restoration and reformation of this country, you have to do it on God's terms. And if you do grieve, and you do mourn, God bless you. You're on a safer path than those who are deluded and asleep because of bread and circuses. When we come back from this break, we'll discuss why we are in fact not a free people, but we are living under the heel of judicial tyranny, far worse than anything the American colonists suffered during the reign of King George III.
You have two choices. I mean, you can try to raise your children by design, or you will raise them by default. There are no perfect parents. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. If we have a plan, we've got a better chance of getting it right in the long run.
There is something deep within the heart of every human being that longs for parental acceptance and approval. When does a boy become a man?
Get a group of guys around and ask them that question.
I don't think there's a certain age. Some men stay boys their whole life.
I would say, 16, 18 years old.
Wow, that's a good question.
When they get bar mitzvah.
Well, I think when he has a child. So I just became at 56, 56 years old.
Without the power of the Holy Spirit changing us and giving us power over our sin, we can't hope to be the dads that our kids need us to be.
I, like you, have heard, and we've already covered on the show, that the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeals from 5 separate states that either through their legislature or through their ballot, some type of referendum, had made it a law that marriage could only be between 2 people of opposite gender, okay? 1 man, 1 woman. No polygamy, no homosexual marriage, whether 2 men or 2 women, 2 women. That was government of the people, by the people, for the people, all right? Ultimately, as history has shown, that's not enough, all right? You can go to the French Revolution and see death, right? Equality, fraternity, liberty, or death. So you can have government that's of the people, by the people, for the people, that is communistic or Sharia law. It doesn't mean that you're going to have law that is true law that comes from our Maker. But I digress. At least in this case, where legislators, the elected officials of various states, or the people of those states through referendums, have banned so-called godless homosexual marriage. I could put a long list of pejoratives there, adjectives, but I won't. And so various circuit courts have, by the way, and if you don't understand how the federal courts work, a district judge is a judge in an area. And depending on the population of the area, that would depend on how big an area that judge covers, and it would also determine how many judges there are. New York City, for example, has an awful lot more federal judges than Romney, West Virginia. Okay? Well, after these individual judges, hither and yon, then they have circuits around the country. There are 11 numbered circuit courts, and also the D.C. Court of Appeals, the District Court of Appeals. So these are the gods who walk among us, all right? They are not elected, they are appointed, and their appointment is for life. So if a judge in New York City rules one way on a certain subject matter, and another judge in New York City rules a different way, then those two are in conflict, and it could go to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, or an individual case could go to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, all right? I had cases that I won at the Supreme Court. I had cases that the Supreme Court refused to hear. When I was sentenced to prison for my part in showing presidential candidate Bill Clinton an aborted baby, a dead 5-month-old baby that had been retrieved from a garbage dump, from a dumpster. Clinton was this close to the baby. A federal judge sentenced me to 5 months in prison for contempt of court for doing it. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals refused to hear my appeal. We appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear my appeal, so I had to serve my 5 months in federal prison. All right, 3 months in federal prison, and then ultimately 2 months under house arrest. So it goes District Court, Circuit Court of Appeals, Supreme Court. Right now, several of the circuit courts have sided with the district judges, all right? The district judge struck down the law of a state. The Circuit Court of Appeal, for that area, and it always encompasses several states, the areas of several states, those circuits have upheld the lower court rulings. The next step in the ladder is the Supreme Court, okay? The Supreme Court refused to hear the petitions of these states where laws were legitimately passed. They just looked the other way and said, no, we're not going to deal with it. So for the time being, those circuit court rulings stand. Now, historically, the Supreme Court does not take a case until 2 of the circuits, 2 of the 11 numbered circuits are in conflict. But right now, all of the circuit court rulings, or the appellate court rulings, if you want to say that, have sided with the promoters of same-gender marriage. We've been overrun, people. Now, forgive me for giving you that history lesson. Go to a book, learn it, memorize it, commit it to memory, but it's critical, and here's why. We don't live in a free society. We do not live under the rule of law. And this should make us sick to our stomachs. This is what we have happening is not what the founders of this republic fought and died for and killed fellow Britons for, okay? Remember, the Americans were British colonists who were shooting bullets at their fellow Britons, okay? They were making widows by killing men, some of whom they knew, okay? It was so we could be free, so we could have representative government, so we wouldn't live under dictators and under tyrants. But we live under tyranny right now. We've got this little band of people, these judges, these black-robed tyrants, who they're like patricians of Rome, and we're the plebeians, okay? And they know what's best for us. And they sit there in their smug little world, their godless little world, where they drink wine together or call each other on their phone or send emails to one another. and they run roughshod over the rule of law, over the will of the American people, over the elective process, over the Judeo-Christian history of our past, and they bring us something so disgusting and vile and vulgar that not even the ancient Greeks and the Romans stooped so low. Don't kid yourself. We're not free. Okay? Don't kid yourself. This is not a Christian nation. All right? We used to be a Christian nation, we could argue. We're not anymore. A Christian nation does not behave this way. We behave like a pagan nation, or at least a nation that is under the heel of judicial tyrants. And we, the people, and our elected officials don't have the guts to overthrow these judicial tyrants in whatever manner is available to us, starting with impeachment, starting with altering the Constitution so that we just say, okay, you can only have a 5-year appointment or a 7-year appointment. We're not going to give you a lifetime appointment where you're out of our reach. I've got to take a break. You can tell that I'm worked up. It's a day to grieve. It is. Do you want to get America out of the hands of wicked and unjust men and women who are destroying the republic before our eyes, and put leadership back into the hands of righteous men and women so that we don't die as a nation? Well, you're talking about social revolution, and there are rules in social revolution. We can look at the victorious social revolutions of the past, such as the end of slavery, the end of child labor, women's voting rights, the end of segregation, and so much more, and learn from their victories. Look at their actions, their images, their rhetoric, their sacrifices, and their final fruit. We will send you this series that originally cost $129, 7 books for students, 1 teacher's guide, if you'll give a gift of any size and just pay for shipping and handling. Take advantage of it today. For those of you who just can't even grasp that we live under the heel of judicial tyranny, if you're African American, look back to Dred Scott. The Dred Scott decision in the 1850s, I think it was a 7-2 decision, said that black human beings were chattel property under the U.S. Constitution and that slavery was legal. Then Plessy v. Ferguson in the late 1890s. Then in that court decision, 7-1, the court said that separate but equal was totally legal. In other words, it was a total affirmation of the Jim Crow laws, which were blatant discrimination against African Americans. Okay? We've dealt with judicial tyranny before, and now we are living under its heel. And people, we are not a free people. So I'm going to talk about the coming elections in the next segment, but I want to put something out there. There's a lot of people right now that are whining and complaining about Michelle Obama's lunch program. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. There's a lot of people whining about English as second language schools. There was a big story about 63 million people in America that in their homes they speak another language besides English, or their primary language in their home. And I can understand why people would say, well, we want them to be able to read English so that they can read our Constitution. Look, let me cut to the chase for a second. Number one, they're killing babies, okay? We've got the militant homosexuals on the march. We have become a slave state to the federal plantation. Our currency is being debased. We have become a debtor nation to the Chinese. We've got really big problems, okay? Big evils that are engulfing us. And we can mock Michelle Obama's lunch program, and I promise you I will. But who cares what language people are speaking in their own home? I want to tell you something about the people who are destroying this nation, okay? You ready? They all speak English. English is their first language. And most of them that are destroying the nation, look at these judges. You know, Sotomayor, Kagan, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Kennedy. Guess what their first language is? Except for maybe Sotomayor. It's English. Right? And Sotomayor learned English really, really well. And she's a part of the problem. So when you get these fundraising letters and you have these people saying, well, we ought not to be letting foreigners in here and all them Hispanic people and speaking a foreign language and they need to be learning English. Didn't do so much good for Sotomayor. Didn't do so much good for Kagan. Okay? The language, I would rather have 100 million people in America that spoke Spanish and they understood el ley del Señor, the law of God. Si una persona quiere hacer la cosa correcto, este es lo que es importa. Are you hearing me? What matters, what's important is that someone wants to do the right thing. They want to stand for the law of God. That's what matters. So if it's English-speaking people who want to drag us into hell, and it's Hispanic-speaking people that want to save the republic, and I'm not saying that's what's happening, but if it was, I'd take that in a heartbeat, okay? Because the 10 Commandments were written in Hebrew. I'll be right back. I have been a leader in the pro-life movement for 30 years. And sadly, we have not prevailed in our goal to make it a criminal act to kill an unborn baby. There's reasons why we have failed. I wrote this book, A Humble Plea, to Catholic bishops, to evangelical clergy, and to lay people, explaining where we went wrong and what we have to do to prevail. We've made this available as a PDF online for free. I encourage you to go and download your own copy. For behold, God is my helper, and the Lord is the protector of my soul. Turn back the evils upon my enemies, and cut them off in thy truth. This is the calm segment of the program, ladies and gentlemen, where I encourage you to go to our website, www.voiceofquietresistance. Oh yeah, it's just Voice of Resistance. The elections are coming up quickly, and many of us are grieving for our country. We want our country to be turned around. And I want to say to you that you can hold a part, a critical part, in restoring this country. And part of that is to do the job that some of our pastors and priests and clerics should be doing, but refuse to do. Remember, the judgment of God started with the elders who were in the temple of God, okay? And I believe that our spiritual leaders are going to give a dreadful accounting for having let this nation collapse into the jaws of hell while they played spiritual tiddlywinks or hid in their safe Christian ghettos. Anyway, I digress. The biggest thing that you could probably do is speak up. Speak up in your church. Whether you've got a testimony time or whether you do it after church, whether you write a little brochure explaining to people how they can sin with their vote and that they need not sin with their vote. If you send a little hashtag out, a little text to all your friends in your little database and say, if you vote for somebody who supports the murder of babies, and then if you know someone in your area, put their name in, say to them, you have sinned against God. I mean, give them an illustration. Say to them, look, if you know that a guy owns a brothel, or he runs a Planned Parenthood that helps pimps and child molesters and people in the sex trade cover up the crimes against 14, 15, 16-year-old boys and girls. If you run a brothel or you run a Planned Parenthood, you're in sin. You're in a criminal act against God and man. And therefore, we're not going to vote for you. Just use an illustration like that. But and then people say, well, yeah, but I like his economic policies. And I agree with him on the Second Amendment. And I agree with him on his plan to help our education and on his trade policy and his support for unions. That's particularly important to me. Okay, so you're going to put your own pocketbook and your own economic interests and your loyalty to the party, whatever that party is, ahead of the lives of innocent babies who are being butchered and 15-year-old girls who are being sold into sexual slavery? That's the kind of ethics you have? That's the ethics you are showing with your vote, go ahead. Shake yourself, and then shake other people up for the sake of truth and for God.